Okay, thank you everyone for your viewing there and for opting in. We're in the home stretch now, and I'd now like to introduce our final speaker for today, and that is Lachlan Blackhall, who is the head of the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program at ANU. Now, I'm not going to say that we've saved the best for last because all of our speakers have been fantastic, but if you are familiar with Lachlan and his work, you will know that we are in for a treat here. So in his work, Lachlan has led the development of capabilities to monitor, optimise and control residential solar generation and battery storage, as well as the development of virtual power plant technology to aggregate energy storage to deliver services to energy networks, markets and utilities. Some of you may also recognise Lachlan as the co-founder of Reposit, a really impressive technology that helps people optimise their energy batteries. Lachlan is delivering the perfect concluding presentation today titled Amping Up for a Storage-Led Recovery. So without any further ado, I will now hand over to you, Lachlan.
Great, thanks very much. No pressure with a build up like that.
Sorry.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm really looking forward to presenting. Before I begin, please allow me to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, which for me is the Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I think it's certainly fair to say the last 6 to 8 months has been pretty challenging for all of us in Australia. And before I kick off, I'd certainly like to extend my best wishes to everyone on the call. I hope you haven't been too badly impacted by 2020 so far. So what I really wanted to talk about today was probably initially to make some framing comments around, where we are in terms of, the energy system, both here in Australia and globally, and use that as a basis for framing why energy storage is going to be so important going forward. But I think the really interesting takeaway that we can make at the moment is we have a pretty unique opportunity to use energy storage to actually deliver economic and social benefit going forward, and particularly in the context of the discussions that are being had nationally about how we are going to ramp up and open up our economy over the months and years ahead. I hope that this is sort of an important way to kickstart how we in the energy industry can actually contribute to all of that. So perhaps just to give you a brief overview of who we are. So I currently head up the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program at the Australian National University in Canberra. And I probably should point out straight up that even though we have battery storage in our name, we're certainly equal opportunist when it comes to energy storage. So to me, we're going to have a lot of energy storage in the grid, and our speakers before me have already pointed that out. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to point that out over the course of this presentation. So our work really covers a broad swathe of different areas. We do look at some of the fundamentals of battery technologies and new materials and new battery chemistries. We do a lot of work thinking about how we model and analyze the grid. It might surprise many of you to realize that even though we have millions of kilometers of electricity network, particularly down at the distribution level, until recently we haven't known that much about how it's behaving and the kind of performance that we see from it. And as we start to move towards a more distributed grid, it's increasingly important to understand that. Lots of the other speakers have also covered off on the fact that we have an increasing need to better control and coordinate some of these assets, and we too have a focus on that. Last but not least, we do a lot of work in the kind of social science and economics and policy space, and I'd really just like to touch on the importance of this, as previous speakers in the panel did. We used to think about having a techno-economic electricity system, but we've increasingly moved towards the point now where we actually have a socio-techno-economic system. We've sort of discovered that we have customers connected. And I think going forward, it's really important that we do place customers at the center of what we do. And that means actually thinking about what it means to be customer-centric from the beginning of the research, development and demonstration works that are being done across industry. So I always like to start with a little bit of history, and I think it's really interesting that we're sort of here talking today about the new opportunity that storage presents, because actually if we go back 160 years to the early 1860s, the very first use of electricity in Australia was actually to light to power lights at Sydney Observatory, which you can see here. And that was actually provided by a battery, because back in the 1860s, we actually hadn't yet invented the dynamo or the generator. So battery storage was actually the single source of electric power that we actually had. And way back in the 1860s, the availability of this early battery storage, which would have looked pretty archaic compared to a nice shiny Powerwall that we see on people's homes today, was that it actually also unlocked the discovery of the electrolysis of hydrogen. And so sort of back in the 1860s, those discoveries were coupled, and now we're currently in the 2020s, and we're starting to think about how battery storage and hydrogen are going to play a really important role in our electricity grid going forward. So really where we are today, both in Australia and looking further afield, is that there's a really significant trend towards renewable generation. And that's obviously being driven by the environmental factors. But on the economics alone, as other speakers have mentioned, renewable generation is the cheapest form of new build generation, bar none. And that's as it is today. So, and that the economic benefits of renewable generation actually just get better and better and better over the years and decades ahead. Obviously though, if we're going to move to a significantly renewable powered electricity system, we need to actually have energy storage to ensure that we can actually balance the system. So that is to fill in the gaps when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, but also to ensure that we can respond to unexpected outages. So when you lose a particular generation asset or you lose transmission infrastructure. And again, energy storage is ideally placed to respond to those energy security requirements. And we've already seen really good examples of how that has worked in South Australia, particularly from the Hornsdale Power Reserve. Perhaps the really exciting thing though about what we're seeing at the moment is that by 2030, renewable generation firmed by energy storage, be it pumped hydro or be it battery storage, will actually be the cheapest form of firm energy. And that's a really exciting development. So we're well on our way here in Australia towards a very high penetration renewable grids. And over the decade ahead, as the economies of firmed renewable generation get better and better, that will hopefully accelerate. The other really interesting trend that we're seeing at the moment is obviously the increasing amount of decentralization that we see in our electricity system. So this is being driven by the uptake of solar PV and residential battery storage, and over the years ahead through the rollout of electric vehicles. So you can see that by 2025, Australia is actually going to lead the world in levels of decentralization. And so Australia, as was mentioned before in the context of South Australia, Australia is a really interesting place to be right now, thinking about how we manage a grid that has both very high renewable penetration, but also very high world-leading levels of decentralization. So I think in the context of both renewables and decentralization, there sometimes tends to be a perception that both of those technologies or technology types are actually troublesome, that they cause problems with our grid. But I think it's actually really important that we reframe how we think about it. There's nothing inherently wrong with operating a grid with high renewables or with a significant amount of decentralization. But it's just that we've moved towards a 21st century electricity grid, and we're still managing it with a 20th century operating paradigm. And so really over the next decade, the thing that's going to have to change is we're going to have to develop the capabilities through storage, through other forms of orchestration and control that allows us to have a 21st century operating paradigm for our 21st century electricity grid. Just in terms of other context, I think for why we're talking so much about energy storage at the moment, we've seen over the recent summer that we increasingly need to ensure our electricity system is resilient. And in the context of both the trend of global warming, but also particular extreme weather events, we need to manage the fact that those temperatures and those extreme weather events mean that we have reduced efficiency from our thermal generators, both gas and coal. We have increased outages of grid infrastructure, particularly transmission. Unfortunately, we also get reduced efficiency from solar panels when the weather's very hot. And we saw through the smoke-filled haze, both in Sydney and Canberra, that we were seeing reductions in generation of between 15 to 45% when we had very hazy weather. So for all of these reasons, the fact that we have an increasing amount of renewables, the fact that we have increasing decentralization, and the fact that we need to support increasing amounts of resilience, energy storage is going to play a really important role in all of that. So given how much we talk about energy storage, and particularly battery storage, it might surprise some people to realize how little battery storage we actually have installed globally. So these are the latest figures from the US Department of Energy's energy storage database. And you can see here just the overwhelming amount of pumped hydro that's been built to date. And largely that's been driven by the fact that pumped hydro is actually a very good companion to thermal generation that we've had in the past. So coal and gas, although gas to a lesser extent. Obviously, we're seeing at the moment a significant ramp up in the adoption of battery storage. But again, to put it in some context, in 2017, when the Hornsdale Power Reserve was installed, so the Tesla big battery, it had a nameplate capacity of 100 megawatts, and that represented 10% of all of the storage installed in 2017. So we're actually installing storage off quite a low base when we start to think about batteries. Maybe the other point I'd make here is that we're also starting to see an increase in the interest and deployment of flow batteries, in particular vanadium batteries. And I've been listening to other speakers and other questions this afternoon. I think it's interesting to point out that we do spend a lot of time thinking about opportunities for lithium battery manufacturing in Australia, but vanadium battery, the opportunities for vanadium flow storage in Australia are also really significant. I probably won't dive into it right now, but happy to explore further in question time if people would like to. So obviously, in this context, we understand that there's going to be a significant amount of energy storage, and we've heard from previous speakers how some of that's going to be pumped hydro, some of it's going to be large grid scale batteries, and this is the Hornsdale Power Reserve, Tesla big battery, and we're also going to see an increasing amount of storage installed in people's homes and connected and integrated into the networks and markets through virtual power plants. So I'm not going to touch on any of those three individually, except to say that it's clear that we're going to see all of those types of storage entering our grid. And as I said before, we really see storage as an underpinning technology for how we're going to operate our electricity grid going forward. Where I'd like to spend the time today is really thinking about these other important opportunities. And these are the opportunities that I think not only allow us to get a significant amount of energy storage into our grid, which is fantastic for all the reasons we've just been talking about. But they're also really interesting opportunities to stimulate new types of business models, economic growth, the development of new capabilities and export opportunities. And so the three areas I wanted to touch on will be community batteries, and I was really pleased to see that come up in the panel discussion, microgrids and standalone power systems, and electric vehicles, which I also refer to as batteries on wheels. The caveat to this discussion is that as we move towards having potentially millions of individual generation and battery and electric vehicle capabilities in our grid, we're also going to need a lot of orchestration and coordination. And so while I won't touch on that extensively today, I think it's really important that we recognize that we need to find these sophisticated new methods of operating our system, which is what I was talking about before when I said moving towards a 21st century operating paradigm. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about community batteries, because I think that there's some really exciting opportunities here, not only to support the rollout of energy storage in the form of battery storage, but also to stimulate the development of new energy retail models. So when we're thinking about a community battery, I think it helps to actually understand what we're talking about. So a community battery might look like this. It might be a shipping container, but it might also be something as small as a fridge. And it could even potentially be smaller than that. So batteries like this would vary in size probably between 100 kilowatts and up to 5 megawatts. And the 5 megawatt limit is not it's not a physical limit. It's just that at 5 megawatts, it becomes scheduled generation. And so there might be reasons why you'd like to keep it below that 5 megawatt mark. So these batteries will be installed, essentially in your street, in your suburb, in your community. And so, one of the interesting challenges, I suppose, to think about with community storage is, while it might have some great outcomes in terms of its use, whether or not you'd be happy to have a battery like this installed in your street is perhaps still an open question. So how would a community battery function? It'd actually function quite similarly to how a behind the meter battery would work. During the day, it would charge up using excess solar generation that's being generated in the local area. It could potentially provide network services to the local network. It could participate in markets for energy and FCAS. And going back to Matt's talk, this is really about understanding the value stack that batteries can deliver. So the reasons you might be, you might want to consider installing community batteries is that there's a pretty significant economy of scale that comes from installing a larger chunk of energy storage, from operating a larger chunk, and then also maintaining, an aggregate amount of energy storage in this way. And so ultimately that would mean that it would be cheaper to install storage in this way than it might be to install it piece by piece behind the meter in people's homes. From the work that we're doing, we believe that with less total storage, our community battery can also actually support more local generation without running into network congestion or breaching the physical or technical limits of the network. We certainly see that community batteries can also increase equity, and ultimately not everybody owns a house or is willing to or able to spend the money to buy solar and batteries in their home. Moving towards community energy models, which will have as part of them, community battery storage, means that these opportunities may be opened up to people who are renters who live in apartments. So on the one hand, it also increases the equity of those who can benefit, but it actually also increases the opportunity for people to be involved. And that may mean that we see significant uptake of community batteries and the sort of retail models that might emerge around them. I think the other interesting one is that obviously these new retail models are something that's really necessary in our grid. I'll talk a little bit about what the community have said when we talk to them, but I think it's fair to say that there's not a lot of love lost when it comes to energy retailers. And this might be a way to actually think about addressing that. So as I said before, on the one hand, there's obviously some benefits that potentially can come from thinking about community batteries. On the other hand, there's obviously some challenges as well that we're going to have to overcome in order to make this happen. The first one is, as I said, it's not entirely obvious that people are going to love having a shipping container installed in their street. And so even though people may want the benefits, actually thinking through the logistics of how we would install a relatively large asset in the grid, in a suburb we're going to have to do a bit more work on. If we're thinking about something that's only the size of a fridge, maybe there's a lot more opportunities to do that, putting it next to the distribution transformers that are already on the street in many cases, or mounting it on existing distribution network poles and wires. Coupled with that is, if we're installing these batteries in the grid, we also have to think about the safety aspects as well. So if you're putting a battery on the side of the road, you need to be mindful of how we're going to ensure that there aren't potential problems caused if there's car accidents nearby. How do we deal with some of the hazardous materials that might be in some batteries when you start to think about vanadium flow and other forms of flow batteries? Probably the biggest question, though, that needs to be answered is the question of how we're going to change tariffs to actually support community batteries. Because at the moment, if a community battery is installed in front of the meter, which it is, potentially you would have to pay 2 lots of network charges. The first lot of network charges would be as you charge it up, and then you would have to pay a second set of network charges as you discharge the battery into someone's home later in the evening. And so this is a real economic disincentive to have a lot more energy storage in the grid in the form of community batteries. I'm really pleased to see that there's a significant amount of work being undertaken nationally, lots of demonstration projects and engagement with the Australian Energy Regulator as well, to think through precisely how we can achieve the upsides of putting more community batteries into the grid, while at the same time finding tariff structures that don't disincentivize them in the way I've just been talking about. So what else do we have to consider when we're thinking about rolling out community batteries? Well, obviously we actually need to think about the community that they're going to serve. So, you know, on the upside, from our work with communities, we've found that they do see community batteries as a way of enabling more renewable generation in the system, and that's something that they see as a really significant upside of a model of this type. The questions they have, though, are who would actually control the battery, and in whose interests would the battery be controlled for? So communities are obviously rightly interested in understanding if they will be able to benefit, particularly for an asset that's been installed in their community. They'd like to understand how not only the benefits of participation in the market, but also profits that are generated can flow back to the community, which could be through some form of community ownership. As I said, it's perhaps not unsurprising to realise that the community is quite distrusting of existing large energy retailers. And I think some of the key quotes that we had from communities and people that we spoke to, and all of these are not the real names of those we spoke to, really point to the fact that there is a really significant trust deficit in the energy system at the moment. So I think there's a really significant opportunity for seeing community batteries roll out into the grid. Customers would be very happy to engage with those models, but we do need to address this trust deficit. Just thinking about other really important opportunities for storage in our grid, we have the concept of microgrids as well. And so microgrids, you know, similarly to you know, community grids community batteries, sorry, are starting to think about how we can develop more local energy models. The difference for microgrids, obviously, is that we're talking about local power systems that are not connected to the grid. Again, though, a microgrid is primarily powered by renewable generation, often in the form of wind and solar, and some form of battery storage. And so the image you can see here is actually of the Escree project near Dalrymple in South Australia. I won't spend a lot of time digging into microgrids more broadly, but I would recommend those of you who are interested have a look at the 2018 report by Horizon Power in WA. Horizon painted a really interesting picture of the opportunities for their energy system for microgrids, but also highlighted the really significant opportunity for jobs that could flow from it. And they were talking about, you know, jobs in the tens of thousands that could flow from thinking about microgrids and other related grid developments. Just noting the time and sort of wanting to leave a few minutes for questions. The other big opportunity, obviously, in our grid is the deployment of battery storage on wheels in the form of electric vehicles. It's probably slightly further off than some of the other opportunities that we've already talked about today. But when Australia decides to take up electric vehicles en masse, there's going to be a really significant influx of energy storage in this form. So if all of the vehicles in Australia went electric today, it would provide more power than 9 Snowy Hydro 2.0s put together. So we're talking about a really significant amount of energy storage, but also power capacity to support energy security in our grid. You know, some of the more far-fetched ideas I've heard that could be practical within the next decade are thinking about the fact that if you have large fleets of electric vehicles that are also autonomous, they could automatically, effectively drive to a point where they could provide services as they're needed. Or if you were to have a situation where you had a blackout, they could actually drive into the city centre to be used as a form of restarting the grid. The other thing that you could start to think about if you have a really significant rollout of electric vehicles is you could actually think about them representing a virtual distribution network. And so the image you can see here is just a tiny fraction of the daily car trips around Brisbane. And if you think about the amount of energy that's actually being transported in the form of electric vehicles, if we had 100% electric vehicle penetration, you can start to realise that actually electric vehicles may be a really important way that we can start to operate our grid to provide flexibility to ensure we meet energy reliability and also energy security. The last point, which I'll just touch on briefly, is we obviously talked earlier, I talked earlier about the real importance of thinking about how we coordinate and orchestrate all of these assets participating together. And that's something that we are going to need a really significant investment in over the decade ahead to ensure we can support a grid that's powered by renewables and distributed energy resources. So storage and these coordination and orchestration capabilities are going to work hand in hand. Finally, I might just sort of touch on some of the lessons that I think we've learned over the last 6 months from COVID-19, because I think they offer us a path forward in terms of how we as an energy industry can think about actually coming together for the betterment of the country. I think if we look at how we responded to COVID-19, we recognize the value of the leadership of experts. I think collectively we all came together, government, community, research organizations and industry. And I think we also recognize the importance, the important opportunity for Australia to contribute to solutions for the world. All of these things, I think, are undoubtedly true about our opportunities in the energy world. And I think a lot of them are going to be built on the opportunities for energy storage. And I might wind up there and say thank you again for the opportunity to present today, and looking forward to any questions people might have.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Lachlan. Really appreciate it and really appreciate your insights as always. I'm conscious of time, so we'll just squeeze in a couple of quick questions while we've got you. You mentioned towards the end there, there's so much that needs to happen. There are so many great technologies available to us. There's obviously quite a lot of coordination that needs to take place, in order to effectively deliver on all of this, or deliver on all of the promise, I suppose. In your view, who should be the coordinating body for this? Who should actually coordinate, ensuring that we do all work together to achieve what we want to achieve? Should it be, the market operator? Should it be the regulator? Who should sort of be overseeing the coordination? Yeah.
Look, I mean, this might sound a little bit like a fence-sitting position, but I think we've got a very robust sort of regulatory umbrella. We have, the energy regulator, the Market Commission, the market operator, obviously, Energy Consumers Australia, who are representing consumers, and obviously the Energy Security Board. I think what's been a really positive development in the last couple of years has been that those 5 organisations have been coming together to actually to deliver that coordination. So I think the model that those organisations have adopted, though, is to collectively come together and agree what needs to be coordinated, but then hand out the responsibility for particular pieces of work to individual organisations. So I don't think it's the responsibility of any one organisation. It would be an overwhelming job if only one of them was taking responsibility. So I think we've got a good balance at the moment. There's probably the necessary tension between those organisations. But that's ultimately going to be a good thing, because it's going to get us to a position that we need to be in.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'll just squeeze in one more question as well. Just on the subject of electric vehicles, batteries on wheels, I wanted to get your thoughts on when you expect to see more of these in the fleet of cars in Australia. So, we often hear about people talking about, commentators talking about, when we can expect to see price parity with fuel-based cars. And I think often it's sort of pitched around the sort of mid-2020s. Beyond price parity, when do you think we'll see more uptake? And then beyond that, do you think we're doing enough to prepare our networks for the change that we'll see as we start to see more of these electric vehicles, batteries on wheels moving around the market?
That's a really good question. I think, numbers of electric vehicles at the moment are low. I think that's pretty well understood. I think Australians have an aversion to, they have significant concerns about range, which I find ironic sometimes, given that in many cases people are driving 20 or 30 kilometres a day around a city, but nonetheless.
Absolutely. We all live in a pretty small bubble.
So I think, from that perspective, we've only just started to see vehicle to grid capabilities emerge within the last 6 months. What's going to drive uptake is obviously increased range, reduction in prices. Many manufacturers of cars have said that by 2030 or 2035, they're not going to be manufacturing internal combustion engines, which means that I think through the next decade, people are genuinely going to be seeing the fact that it's not going to be viable to continue to buy a petrol-powered car. And by that point, you'd imagine that the price has come down sufficiently that more people are interested in electric vehicles. In terms of the grid side of things, I think, if we spend a lot of time thinking about solar generation at the moment, and so we're preparing the grid for lots of export. Many of the capabilities we're developing to handle export actually could work equally well to handle significant demand from electric vehicles charging in the evening. So I think as long as we have an eye to the future for those capabilities, we'll actually be quite well prepared, when they do arrive. Maybe the one comment I would make is Australians are typically fast followers. So there's been lots of predictions about both the uptake of batteries and the uptake of EVs, both of which have been wrong. But when we do start to acquire these technologies, we're going to do so very quickly. And we see that with solar. We've been shocked at the rate of adoption, and I suspect that we'll be shocked by the rate of adoption of both batteries and EVs when it happens.
Yeah, when the tide starts to turn, it starts to turn very quickly.
Absolutely.
All right, look, given the time, I'll wrap things up there. So thank you once again, Lachlan. Really appreciate your time and your insights today.
Pleasure.